Welcome to Coffee and History, a conversation with Alabama Heritage. We are your hosts. I'm Rebecca Mender.
I'm Susan Reynolds.
And I'm Caroline Gizera McKenzie.
Join us as we sit down with some of the most fascinating folks in the Alabama community as we bring you the stories of Alabama that educate, inspire, and entertain. Before we dive into today's conversation with our guest, let's kick off things with our Did You Know segment. And I think, Susan, you have a fun fact for us and our listeners today.
I do, but I think you might know this fun fact.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So did you know that the first African Baptist church in Tuscaloosa, which is an important civil rights history site, was first established in 1866 with around 140 members of the African American community in the city?
I actually did know that.
I knew you did. The Reverend Prince Muriel was the first pastor, and he served until 1885. And in June 1964, the site became the organization point for a group of marchers who planned to walk together to the courthouse a few blocks away. And they were going to protest the Jim Crow laws.
Right.
And the march never took place because they were preemptively stopped and attacked by police and a mob of people who came there to the site.
And then there is actually a light at the end of that tunnel. And our guest will probably talk a little bit more about that, because that is a very important location in the Tuscaloosa Civil Rights Trail. And I think we'll talk a little more about that. We'll ask our guest and see if he knows the answer as well.
I think he does.
I think he does as well. So our guest is a professor at the University of Alabama in History and African American Studies. He's also the director of the Summersell Center for the Study of the South. He is a founding member of the Tuscaloosa Civil Rights History and Reconciliation Foundation and has been a commentator on matters of Southern and Black history for NPR, APR, CNN, C-SPAN, USA Today, and all the other acronyms.
What hasn't our guest done?
Well, now he's on CNH for Coffee and History.
Okay.
So he's authored 6 books, or edited 6 books, including his most recent, which is Bloody Tuesday, The Fight for Civil Rights in Tuscaloosa. So welcome to the Coffee and History podcast, Dr. John Giggie. Welcome, John.
We're excited that you're here.
It's really wonderful to be here with you guys.
Yeah, it's good to have you add an acronym to all of the other shows that you've been on. So CNH is probably going to be the most popular that you've done.
You'll definitely be talking about this for years to come.
Yeah, I'll lead with it.
Wow. It's like, that's going to be the first sentence in his bio. It's not I'm award winning. It's not I've authored these books, but I was a guest on Coffee and History. So there you go. So John, let's talk about First African Baptist Church. And I know a lot of people are unfamiliar with the church and its history. And obviously Bloody Tuesday was what Susan was referring to when these people were trying to march to integrate or have the courthouse integrated. And so you wrote a book about it. You've written an article for Alabama Heritage about it, which we appreciate. Thank you very much. But can you tell our listeners a little bit about why that event was so pivotal and what made you realize that this needed to be in a book form?
Bloody Tuesday is part of one of the last great untold stories of the civil rights movement. For too many years and too many ways, this history has been either covered up, hidden, or not fully explored. I learned about it by going to meetings across the city and listening to Black citizens talk to me about what they called was the worst day of their life. Mm-hmm. And then they would refer me to this day, June 9th, 1964, when over 500 Black men, women, and children, some as young as 10, gathered at First African with the hope of marching downtown to protest Jim Crow laws. They never made it because the city and law enforcement and the Klan, which at this time had a national headquarters here in Tuscaloosa, they decided that June 9th would be the day that they would stop the movement in West Alabama and to make First African Baptist, where these people were just gathering, this would be the end.
Yeah.
And so they circled that church, law enforcement and the Klan, and they refused to let folks march, kept them inside, and eventually they blew out the stained glass windows with water shot from a fire hose. Soon after that, they flooded the church with tear gas, and they kept them inside as long as possible. Eventually, the folks started jumping out of windows, coming out the back doors, and then they were beat mercilessly with sticks, with the butts of revolvers, with bats spiked with nails. Over 100 went to jail that day. Several hundred were badly injured. Many sought refuge at Druid City Hospital. More sought refuge by local Black physicians. Many ran down the street to a barbershop, Reverend Linton's barbershop, and there it became a first aid station. Over the years, those that lived through what they called the worst day of their life, they kept that story deep inside them for several reasons. One is, very quickly, this story of Black protest and law enforcement's violent reaction was covered up. And just as this story was the largest invasion of a Black church during the movement by law enforcement, because the Klan and law enforcement went into First African and beat people and pulled them out, it was also the site of the greatest cover-up of the movement. There's a reason most of us don't know this. It's because the local press, the state press, the regional white press was able to frame this as an effort by Black thugs to rampage downtown, and law enforcement was well within its rights to use extraordinary force to preserve and protect life and liberty across Tuscaloosa.
So they didn't actually, the news did not actually report it accurately, is what you're saying.
Correct. So the white newspapers tended to pull together a fictional narrative that empowered the police and portray Black protesters as criminals, as thugs.
Right.
I should say that it was a national moment where people were looking at this. The New York Times was here, the Washington Post, and they did cover it in a fair way, but it didn't last, because when people called Reverend King's office and begged him to come to Tuscaloosa, he said no. He was already committed to go back to St. Augustine, Florida, where he had been running a protest in the spring. And when King moved to St. Augustine's, he was based in Atlanta when they made the phone calls. The media followed him. And so what happened was this media vacuum in Tuscaloosa, and the only people reporting on it, for the most part, were white newspapers, local and state, that were invested in creating this fictional narrative. The one exception was the Black press, but it didn't have the resources or the manpower to cover this in a sustained and committed way. So you'll see in presses like the Pittsburgh Courier, flares of stories about Black or Bloody Tuesday, but they didn't sustain. They didn't have the resources to cover this. They too followed Reverend King. So because of this story became the exclusive purview of those that lived through it.
Right.
And for much of the last 60 years, they've kept it deep inside them. The other piece of this, that when I listen to people talk and how angry they still are sometimes, or how ashamed they feel that the city and the state that they love couldn't, in many ways, report on this accurately, is that there was never any kind of legal inquiry. There was no court trial. There was no effort by the state to begin to peel back and look at what happened. And there, on the one hand, Black folks could have had the opportunity to testify to what they lived through. But on the other, white folks who were part of that violence would have been asked to account for their actions.
Right. And I'm sure that the Black community was probably too afraid to speak up for themselves.
In many ways they were, because don't forget, this again was the center for the Klan nationally, right. And people grew up with stories.
And we had, so the Klan was actually based in the Alston building, which is probably, 4 blocks away from First African Baptist Church. So it was, so you got First African Baptist Church, and about 2 blocks away from that is the county courthouse that Susan was talking about that they were marching to. And then basically a block and a half away from the courthouse is the Alston building, where the United Klans of America was holding their the top floor, I think, was basically their headquarters. So, I mean, logistically, geographically, that's pretty close. And so I can just see them being, horrified and, afraid to tell their stories.
Every Black person I've spoken with who lived through that day, who grew up during this time, they had a story about the Klan.
Right.
In some way, in some manner, the Klan had terrorized them or a family member. What's interesting, though, is part of the reason Tuscaloosa becomes such a explosive point during the movement's history is not only because you had a large group of Black citizens beginning to protest, not only because you had the Klan here based in Tuscaloosa, but also Reverend King came here in March of 1964, 3 years before Bloody Tuesday, and he knew the power of integrating Tuscaloosa could hold for the movement nationally. If these Black citizens could somehow integrate Tuscaloosa, if they could somehow beat the Klan in their own backyard, it would carry enormous power for those seeking to support Reverend King and join his movement.
Right. Well, I think it's amazing for, Susan and I especially, we grew up here.
Yeah.
Never heard this story.
I never heard this story. I have heard other stories that have been very scary concerning the Klan here in town, but I had never been taught anything about Bloody Tuesday.
Right. So in our schools, and it's like, so is that one of the reasons too why you felt like this would make a good book, is because there was like this vacuum of media coverage during that time period, but then also because of people like who are, Susan and I, who are residents and didn't know about it. I mean, to me, that was just,
even for all of us that come into the state of Alabama that aren't originally located from Tuscaloosa.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard of Bloody Tuesday being an out-of-state student, until I actually came to the state. And then I didn't learn about the full story until your article when I was working for the magazine. So I want to thank you for informing me of that, of course.
Thank you for educating everybody.
Yes.
I think there are a lot of reasons why Bloody Tuesday should be remembered and commemorated almost on a yearly, if not daily basis. The story belongs in the schools, especially locally, because this is the history of the community we live in. But at a more abstract level, there's something important about placing Bloody Tuesday, which occurred in Tuscaloosa, June of '64. It comes after the Birmingham campaign and before the march from Selma to Montgomery. But it's a pivotal turning point in two different ways. One is rising levels of Black protest. Many of those who were part of Tuscaloosa would join the Selma to Montgomery March. The local minister in charge, Reverend T.Y. Rogers, would join Reverend King on the steps of the Capitol in Montgomery and preach at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. But also, sadly, many of the tactics we've seen captured on film in Selma, in which state troopers charged John Lewis and his colleagues on the bridge, when they used tear gas, when they used those batons. By choosing the bridge itself, it was a very confined space. Black folks couldn't get off that bridge. They were trapped.
Right.
Those were the types of tactics that were refined in Tuscaloosa. Think not of the bridge, but of a church as an enclosed space. Think of those troopers and law enforcement using tear gas, using batons, using cattle prods. Very similar tactics that were then imported to Selma in a desperate effort to slow down, if not stop, the movement.
That's heartbreaking to think about.
And this was a year, for people who aren't familiar, this is actually a year, so in advance of Selma. So Tuscaloosa's Bloody Tuesday happened in 1964, and that's, a year in advance of what happened in Selma. And almost everybody knows about Selma now. I mean, there's movies that have been made about it. And so that's, again, what John's saying is that, you're sandwiched in between what happened in Birmingham and then what happened in Selma. But we had this own big story that was not talked about.
Yeah. And John, I know when you were working on the article for us, we talked about there was so much material that you had that wasn't able to be included in the book. Is there a story or a particular interview that you wish you could have either given more attention to in the book or could have included and just didn't have room?
Yeah. I think two things I wish I had more time to spend on. One was to explore the ways in which the Tuscaloosa campaign, as it was often called, was a women's movement. Mm-hmm. That the number of women who were involved as leaders, as fundraisers, who were marching, it was pretty significant in ways I haven't seen across the Deep South. I think the one interview I wish I had more time was with Reverend Linton, of course, who owned the barbershop where people flooded to in order to receive care. One of the last interviews I had with him was during COVID, and he would die shortly thereafter. And he was at his barbershop. We walked outside, and we were watching trains go by. He's right by a switching yard. And he pulled me aside, and he said, I need to tell you about a story that just won't quit me. I wasn't sure what he was going to talk about. And he told me about, shortly after the movement, and right after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in '65, he said he gave a shave and a haircut to a white politician who had come into his shop. He wouldn't give me his name. Mm-hmm. And I really tried to get that name, but he wouldn't give it.
Took it to his grave.
And he said after the haircut, the white politician stood up. And he waited before he paid Reverend Linton. And then he slowly pulled out a dollar bill. And he held it out to Reverend Linton. And when Reverend Linton went to grab it, the white politician held it. So for a long second, they were staring at each other. Mm. Finally, the white politician let it go. And he told Reverend Linton, just give us 50 years and we'll take it all back. And so for Reverend Linton, this prophecy that in 50 years, we'll take it all back, which I interpreted to be that some of the advances of the movement would be taken back. He took that story to the grave with him, and I think he was worried. He was deeply worried, but as he said, he couldn't quit it. It would haunt him. Mm-hmm. And now as we go forward here in Alabama and across the Deep South, it's our story.
Yeah.
what does it mean when right after the movement, someone prophesied that give us 50 years and we'll take it all back.
Right. And I mean, with all the headlines that you're hearing and seeing and what things are, all the progress that has been made, and then you can see a lot of that being taken back. And so not knowing who this man was or woman, whoever it could have been, well, I guess it was a shave and a haircut, so it was probably a man. But it is kind of unfortunate because I feel like there's so much work that has been done and so much progress that has been made that it's really kind of sad that Reverend Linton, all the work that he did, and then this is one of the things that continued to haunt him because he was being accurate in his prophecy there.
Mm-hmm. But what I admire most about you, Rebecca, is your work to the Tuscaloosa Civil Rights Trail and the work on the Reverend Linton Barbershop Project, which, of course, you and John are working on together. Yeah. So, John, would you mind telling us and our listeners more about that?
So the first thing we did, actually, Reverend Linton and myself, was try to imagine what a civil rights tour or guide could look like, and then it expanded to involve Rebecca and other citizens across the area. That took a long time to write because of the way we did it. We identified a series of key institutions or houses or places that played a major role in the Black freedom struggle. We solicited information from the community, but then we asked members of the community to write about each of these stops because we didn't want us as historians or journalists to write it ourselves. We thought it was important for community members to be in charge of the authorship. Then we gathered those stories together and those small articles and knitted together a Civil Rights Trail Guide. What's interesting now is that it's bequeathed other types of investments. I think most importantly, the city schools are finding ways to teach locally about the civil rights movement and use what happened in Bloody Tuesday or the work of men and women here to talk about national themes in the movement, to place Tuscaloosa in between Birmingham and Selma in its appropriate place. But more recently now, Reverend Linton's barbershop, once he passed, was purchased by the city with the intention of creating a memorial and a park. We're coming very close to that fruition now. I visited just a few days ago, and it's a really interesting and powerful space because those familiar with the history of the city know that this was a fulcrum for protest and for Black creativity and Black businesses that were based in this space. But secondly, it seeks to use public land now to talk about the movement in a way that hasn't been done publicly yet. It's the city's most significant investment in reshaping Tuscaloosa's landscape to honor those civil rights veterans and their stories. And most notably, the site's going to contain quite a bit of stories. If you walk through it, you'll see efforts to put into print and on placards a short version of what we were talking about today. And that's critical because we want these stories to be passed on through generations. We want that space to be a gathering place for children, for adults, where ideas and hopes and aspirations for the movement can continue to be birthed there and go forward.
And now you mentioned a museum, correct?
Yeah, the next stage will be to try to find a place where we can house the artifacts that Reverend Linton had collected. His barbershop was much more than a barbershop. It was a homemade museum to the movement itself. And its walls were crammed with pictures that were framed of local civil rights victories, but also larger ones like President Obama's election. At the same time, though, those walls were also covered with symbols of segregation. So he had signs that indicated colored and white water fountains and bathrooms. I think the most important artifact was a framed certificate or the original certificate of his voting registration. And if you sat in a barber chair that he would cut your hair at, you couldn't help but see it because he had tacked it to the wall. The objective is to use all of these types of artifacts and display them in a space. We're still looking for the best space for that. I think there are lots of really powerful places, whether it be a local Black church or partnering with the local museum to create an area where these can be put in place and then viewed by the next generation.
I love that. I'm really excited to see this project come to fruition.
You had mentioned about the students and locally having students learn more about this. And I know that you actually helped develop this program called History of Us. Is that correct? And that was something that was started at my and Susan's alma mater, Central High School, but then picked up by the local city school district because it was so successful. So can you tell our listeners exactly what this History of Us project for the schools was? And, what do you think the students, how do you think they benefited from that?
History with Us was conceptualized actually with Reverend Linton, because one of his dreams was to have local students learn about his history, local Black history. So that was the inspiration, and we worked with the city schools at the highest levels to imagine a course that would run a year long that would focus on local Black history, but also empower students to become their own historians. So often when we would do the civil rights movement in class, we would ask students to go home and interview the oldest member of their family about what was life like in Tuscaloosa back then. Ironically, some of the students that did that, their parents and grandparents became part of the book that I wrote about Bloody Tuesday.
Oh, that's so cool, actually.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
But what's really interesting is for many students, this was the first time they saw their own history in a history book, or they heard about stories of their family that weren't just family stories, but could be knitted into a larger tapestry of the civil rights movement. At a more abstract level, we tried to use Tuscaloosa in West Alabama as a central place to talk about all kinds of history. Mm-hmm. So we talked about slavery. We looked at slavery in West Alabama. We looked at the Civil War. We looked at the Civil War in Tuscaloosa. It was a way to try to knit together local history with national themes to bring history alive for our young people. It still exists. It's moved across the city. Many of the students that I taught that year came to the University of Alabama to work with me more so. Many of them were the first in their families to go to college.
Oh.
So in some ways, it was exactly what I think Reverend Linton and older veterans of the movement wanted, a kind of educational experience that could empower and excite students to do more of this type of work. I should add a legacy of that class is the city schools are now working towards embedding Bloody Tuesday and other parts of local civil rights history into a permanent curriculum for K through 12 individuals.
Well, that's phenomenal.
Now, is it just the city schools, or do you know if it's county schools too, or could it expand to the entire state eventually?
It could expand. One of our projects this semester was to assemble over 200 primary documents. We're going to place them online, and any teacher who wants to create curricula or lesson plans can just pull from these. And we're offering to work with the city schools to act as advisors to build curricula that could work from these primary documents to help students see their own hometown or county as embedded in history as a way to further make them enthusiasts of local history.
You know, I was giving a presentation a couple of years ago, and I can't even remember where I was and who I was talking to. But of course, I was bragging on you and talking about this program because that's something I know Susan and I, if that class was available back when we were in school, we definitely would have taken it. And when I was telling him about it, you know, this person, they got so excited. They were like, you know, can we bring this to Huntsville? And I said, of course you can. I mean, I feel like this is something that really should be, you know, everybody needs to learn about their own history in their own backyard, whether it's the Civil War or it's civil rights or whatever the history may be. But I just thought that was so cool that, you know, there were other school districts, people who were teaching right now history to high schoolers, that they would love to have some type of program like this brought to their school district. And so I think it would be wonderful to see that expand to whether it's city school, county school, private schools, you know,
across the state would be amazing.
Well, I mean, everybody should know the history of their own backyard besides Alabama football.
And John, do you have a website we can put into our bio about this, or are we still a work in progress on that?
It's still a work in progress.
Okay.
It's being revised as we speak, actually.
Great.
I do want to add, although we're talking about K through 12, I've been so impressed with Stillman College and the way that their professors and their administrators are also trying to make Stillman civil rights history into a new piece of their education.
Nice.
So several professors I've worked with at Stillman, they've converted part of their art gallery into a memorial space for Stillman civil rights veterans. I should add that Stillman College was essential for the protest in Tuscaloosa.
And let's just say for our listeners that Stillman College is one of our local HBCUs.
Yes. Yeah, Stillman College has a long history in West Alabama. It's been an engine for mobility and genius and civil rights protests for its entire existence. And during the movement itself, it was so closely tied to the Tuscaloosa campaign that often Reverend Rogers, who was in charge of our local movement, he would time the protests or his talks to Stillman's schedule because he wanted those students to be there. He was inviting faculty to come and participate. What we know now is that hundreds of Stillman students were marching, and there's an effort now to remember them, and they're covering their walls with pictures of Stillman students who were involved in the protest.
That's great.
It's
really
special.
To have that inspiration in front of them like that, you know.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, you have also worked with UA students. There was the lynching project and research that you did. And I'm just curious, could you tell us a little bit more about that? And also how you prepared and also at the end of the project helped students deal with that heavy sort of emotional toll that they came across.
So a related project to looking at civil rights here in West Alabama is looking at a longer history of racial violence. This was conceptualized with staff members from Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery. And their interest was, can you help us? Because their idea is we want to nationally capture how many folks were lynched in the Deep South, where it happened, and then ask why. Why don't more Americans know about that? What they can't do is what we try to do in this particular class, which is called Alabama Memory. And it's focused less on where and why someone lost their life unjustly, but who were they before the worst day of their life? Who did they love? Who did they leave behind? Where did they go to school? Where did they go to church? Many of these individuals died twice to history. The first was at the immediate point of their death. But then secondly, they disappeared from public records. And it's very difficult to find both truthful and trustworthy records about lynched individuals in Alabama. Most of the records are found in white newspapers, which categorically would create falsehoods about why someone was allegedly a criminal. And I would never investigate why an event happened. The goal in this class is we identify certain counties around the state, and then undergraduates and grad students will spend a semester or a year or longer tracking down, effectively trying to write an obituary about these folks who lost their lives to lynching.
That's a great idea.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it came to me, again, about almost 8 years ago, and Brian Stevenson, the founder of EJI, was here in Tuscaloosa to commemorate 10 lives lost to lynching in Tuscaloosa. Since then, that list is now up to 100.
Wow.
Wow.
And it's simply going through court records, expanding the archival databases that we use. But it's also quite shocking because it makes very clear how violent this South could have been, but also makes clear the work that needs to be done. Because all these individuals, the 90 we don't know enough about, they need to have their story preserved and protected and told in some way, commemorated. It's
Absolutely.
vital.
You know, I want to address that because I know at EJI, when they first opened the memorial, they had these markers that if no one's ever been, please search it and look it up, because the Equal Justice Initiative, they created this museum in this park. And this remembrance space, they have these huge metal markers that list all the names of the people who were lynched, whether it's, a state or a county in that state, or it's a big movement, a whole bunch of people that happened in like a big mass lynching at one time. And the point was, because I've had people ask me this, and they've probably asked you as well, is that Brian Stevenson created one marker that was going to stay permanently in that park, in that museum, but then there was a second marker on the grounds that each county, it was their responsibility to actually collect it and then find a place to display it. And one of the reasons why Alabama has not done that, or Tuscaloosa County, I should say, has not done that, is because it's not accurate because of the research that you've done. And so I think, like you said, there was 10 when he came to Tuscaloosa, and we have a historic marker downtown recognizing that. And so I think a lot of people just didn't understand, well, why didn't Tuscaloosa pick theirs up, and why is it still there? Well, we're still working on the research to make sure that we accurately document those people. But, Susan did ask a great question about the students, because whether you're a high school student or a college student, you're still young and still learning these things. And so just offboarding that, at the end of the semester, it's like been through some heavy stuff with these kids. And so, how do they process that emotional work? Or are they do they keep it up and call you every night and say, Dr. Giggie, I just can't take it anymore? And are they excited to continue that work? It'd be interesting to see how they feel about it.
It is really heavy work.
Yeah.
And we talk about this all the time in class, and we factor in days where we just take a break and have lunch together.
That's good.
But also, it's important in the study of racial violence, not just to focus on the violence, but themes of resiliency, of community response, of love that transcends any kind of specific violent episode. So in as much as we try to track down these individuals' lives, we also want to hold them up and see the ways that communities wrap their arms around family members that were working with this, To that end, we speak with people who volunteer to come to class or be part of our class to share what it was like to grow up in a family like this.
Right.
And again, the theme here is not so much that the violence wins, but themes of resiliency and community creation around these events so that people recognize that even though this was an unjust and evil episode, it didn't define an individual, a family, or a community. I think striking that balance is what allows students to keep with this work. Many I work with semester after semester, year after year.
Right.
They become graduate students that dedicate much of their professional lives to this type of research, or they go to law school and they look at working on civil rights or larger issues of social justice.
Right. But just, like you were saying, writing somebody's obituary to honor that person in such a way is a big deal, not just for that person, but for their family. And so, a lot of people don't even think about obituaries and how important that document actually is, but it does tell such a huge story of a person, and it's a historical document. And that's why when I see obituaries with errors in them, it just drives me insane. It's like, oh, that's not how their name is spelled. That's not when they were born. That's not where they went to school. That's not the name of their kids. I mean, all these different elements, but I just feel like it's so important to get those stories told and get it told right. And writing an obituary is a great way of doing that.
We were working in Elmore County, up just north of Montgomery, and there's the Elmore County Black History Museum, which has the largest collection of Black obituaries in the Deep South, outside of Atlanta. I was working with one of their curators who, ironically, had actually been in this building when it was a Rosenwald school, which is a formerly all-Black school. And she was pulling out these obituaries. And she said, Dr. Giggie, if I'm going to write about one of these people you're researching, this is what it should look like. And so she was showing these older obituaries from black individuals and how rich they were, how detailed they were. And she looked at me and she said, this is what you need to do. So it's a specific type of obituary. Often the ones you might see in a newspaper are very brief and almost epigraphic.
Right.
What we try to do is be very full and expansive and list those organizations that a person was part of. Expand the family tree as many generations as we can. Look at places of work or of worship. Try to create a portrait that's been lost to time. It was a blessing to meet these folks in Elmore County because they really showed us a way to recover the past in a way that I think is the best way we can do it.
Gosh, when I grow up, I want to be John Giggie. Y'all, I mean, you're doing incredible work.
Thank you.
Throughout all of this research, you and your students have documented nearly 20 Black women who were lynched in Alabama. What are the challenges of that to find in that archival silence? Because like you just said, you're trying to figure out the person and what they were doing, where they worshiped, there's a whole big, large group or part to this human.
It seems like there was always more emphasis on the men who got lynched than it was the women.
So if you go from 10 to 100 and then there's nearly 20 women, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. There's no more challenging piece of looking at racial violence focusing on Black women, because if Black men were intentionally forgotten or written about evilly, it's even more so with Black women. There, it's a different genealogical lift, because you're often working through a woman's husband or her male family names and going either back all the way to slavery sometimes to find these individuals' roots, or going forward from, say, the 1910s to the present. These names change. There's a degree of carelessness with Black women's genealogical data that is much worse than with Black men. So we're constantly trying different name variations when we go to courts. We're using databases. We're constantly looking at, well, the person's name is listed as Bertha. Can you spell that 5 different ways?
Right.
And this takes hours.
Yeah.
One way we've moved around this a little bit is we do oral histories of people who will ask us, will you listen to me as I tell you about my family? And what we've discovered is that for many Black women living today who have memories of a lynching in their family, it seems to have hit differently. In many cases, Black women, if they're lynched, the family will often move very quickly, or it'll reconstitute itself under someone else's purview and wing. Mm-hmm. Also, sometimes Black women will take on enormous responsibility if a Black male member has been lynched in their family. And so you see these elaborate family trees in which suddenly families are living together and women are working together to try to compensate, successfully I should say, and move the family forward. When you look at attempted lynching, which we also track, We often notice that if there's an attempted lynching of a black man, he leaves. Right? He'll go to Chicago or New York and not come back. For black women, they don't leave. Right? They often stay they might move within the state, within the community, but they do not leave. There's a kind of their expectations perhaps, or their needs are local, and they can't as easily just move north to escape the violence.
I find that really interesting.
Yeah, and it's any kind of archival work with women is definitely hard, but especially with Black women. I mean, that's always so challenging. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. And, you're talking about speaking with family members who remember things that happened in their families. And of course, we're losing a lot of the elders from the civil rights movement and other historic events in our country. And this is a question I've kind of posed to a couple of people now, and I'm so grateful for the technology that we have, right, that allows us to research and communicate with people easily. But how we, and especially young people, are learning about history now, it seems to be in bite-sized chunks. AI is a huge influence in education right now. And this mass consumption of bite-sized information is just really something I'm having to grapple with sometimes. So what do you see as the future of people in roles in public history and public education? Do you have any ideas how AI or technology may evolve how we do public history or change it in some drastic way?
Well, we're also learning right now.
Yeah.
This technology is so young, and it's limitless right now, it looks like. I think what it does very well is organize and communicate data. Mm-hmm. What it doesn't do very well is capture and investigate the most important stories of the South. No AI is ever going to capture a black woman talking about what it was like growing up in Elmore County, knowing that she had lost a family member to lynching. No AI is ever going to be able to compensate or represent a black civil rights space here in Tuscaloosa. I think the trick is balance. But for all of us, we want to confirm our ambition to capture the most important stories. Mm-hmm. That often means doing a lot of work in the community. Are we willing to leave our offices, leave our perches, and go talk to people and trust that they know what we need to know? AI can't do that for us. What AI can do is then take those stories and offer suggestions on how best to communicate them digitally. AI is wonderful at synthesizing literatures and giving you ideas as why a story, how it helps historians or public history scholars imagine the world differently. What I find myself doubling down on are the human stories. Mm-hmm. This is what AI can't touch. And for too long in too many ways, we haven't spent enough time in different corners of the South just asking folks, what was life like? What do you want your grandchildren to know about you? What is it you think school children need to know about your life in this time and in this place? That's irreplaceable.
I agree. And I know when I was working on my master's and PhD in the English department, we had a very robust and still have a very robust creative writing program. And a lot of the students would come in, and I'm not really sure what vision of the South that they had, right? But a lot of times by mid-semester, it might change to frustration and not quite knowing what to do with themselves in this space that they're living in for the first time. And I always had, every semester, I would have a conversation with another grad student and say, you go talk to somebody. Just go out and talk to somebody who owns a business in the street, anything, and you will find stories that will blow your mind.
I think that's really important because what AI does is it takes old data and tries to interpret it in new ways.
Right.
It can't give you new data.
Exactly.
Right? That's our job. Mm-hmm. And the new data often rests deep in the hearts and minds of Southerners. That's where we need to be, just to listen and trust that they'll help us imagine a new way to teach, a new way to research, a new way to commemorate that AI cannot give us right now.
I agree. That's a good answer.
I mean, there's so much.
The human element is just too important. It will never be replaced.
Exactly. I mean, because, we can use AI for lots of things, but it will definitely, first of all, it is going to churn out whatever is on the internet because that's what it's doing is it's just researching whatever is already available for human consumption. So it could be accurate or inaccurate.
Right.
But then there's also that human element. And so even when I've told people, well, you can use AI like Copilot to help you craft an email if you don't know how to word it correctly.
Or write an obituary.
But if you would just look at it before you send it and then make sure that there is that, is it using words that you wouldn't normally say? Or, there's got to be that human element to it. So I just don't think AI is going to be able to take everything away from us. And like, you're saying is that it's up to us to tell what's happening, what's going to happen in the future, because it can't really predict.
It's so new. We're still working it out. But
Yeah, I think as well, though, AI is making more vital oral histories or one-on-one interviews. That's what AI can't do, right? And so at a different level, then, it's making us think, what does oral history mean to historians and to journalists? And this is often controversial for historians and journalists because can you trust these stories? Right? Many, many times when I hear a story about an event, I can't easily corroborate it. It doesn't exist in a newspaper. It's not written about by a journalist or a historian. So what do you do when someone tells you a story that you can't corroborate in a traditional way? Do you believe it or do you not? That, I think, is where AI can push us to believe it. I've given many talks over the last year or so because so much of my work is based on oral histories. And usually at some point a hand will shoot up, and it could be a physician, it could be a lawyer who will say, in my world, we can't trust patient histories because they forget or they minimize. And a lawyer will say, we can't trust first-person witness testimony sometimes. So how can you trust these oral histories? My response is, how can you not trust them? Right? And what also gives more power to a written word over a spoken word? Why do we want to give less importance to memories, recognizing that they can change over time, that sometimes they're affected by trauma and by age, but still they need to be validated once again as critical pieces of our past that we need to spend more time on, because that's what AI can't do. And I think that's where the future resides more than anywhere right now.
Everybody has a story to tell. I remember things from my childhood that maybe if you asked me 10 years ago, I may have said the same story, but maybe a little differently. So, things will change over time, but still, you just have to appreciate for what it is. John, we're going to switch gears. We've been a little pretty serious here today, and we've had a great conversation with you, but we do have a segment that's called Before You Go, where we just ask you a few random questions just to get to know you a little bit better. And so I'm going to ask the first question. I want to know if there's anybody from the civil rights movement that you could have dinner with tonight. Who would it be? And you're not allowed to say Reverend Linton, because I know how much he meant to you. He's no longer with us. And I know he was your barber, and he was your good friend and your mentor. So you can't say Reverend Linton. But anybody from the civil rights movement that you would like to have dinner with tonight who's no longer with us?
It might be John Lewis. But I'm interested less in who he became, that man on the bridge in Selma, but how he became that man. Because he was part of a world of Nashville. He's going to seminary and school there. And he, C.T. Vivian and James Bevel, they're all learning about the idea of nonviolence as a way to live your life. I want to know more about that. What was it like to be a young college student in your early 20s, and you're learning about this theory of nonviolence. You're learning about what it would mean to change the Deep South in ways that you might risk your life. But for you, this is the only way to live. Like, what caused that spark? What sustained that enthusiasm?
I want to sit in on that dinner when you have it.
Too. This is a totally unserious question. But, if you could choose a superpower to have, what would it be?
It would be the ability to remember everything.
Oh, yeah.
Because I was just doing an interview the other day, and it wasn't being taped. And I was scribbling furiously. And then I went back to look at my notes, and I knew I was forgetting something. And I was terrified I was forgetting the most important part.
Yeah.
And I wonder how often I've done that. That I go to an interview or I speak with somebody, I have a framework in my head, and I miss something. It could be a tone, it could be just a body posture, but I wish I could just hold on to everything I hear and then use it in my writing and my teaching.
Nice.
If our listeners didn't gather, you're kind of a busy man. So what is your favorite way to relax?
If I wasn't a historian, I'd probably be a soccer coach.
Okay.
And for many years, I coached high school soccer here in Tuscaloosa, including coaching Rebecca's daughter. Aww. And so now I don't coach. I will in a few years. I think I'll go back to coaching like very young children. I would love to spend more time watching soccer and visiting different soccer stadiums around the country and around the world, in Europe in particular.
So since you were my daughter's soccer coach, did you ever play a sport yourself?
I did play soccer in college, which is sort of where the interest came from. Then high school, track, basketball, and soccer.
Did you go on scholarship for soccer?
I went to a very small liberal arts college in New England. I played soccer there, but I was a very average player on an average team.
What was your position?
Defense in the back.
All right.
Nice. What is one book every Alabamian should have on their shelf?
Oh, good question. That's a hard question.
That could vary too.
I think Reverend King's effort to talk about his time in the Birmingham jail is essential reading. Of course, he's imprisoned during the Birmingham campaign, and he talks about not only what the experience is like being imprisoned and fighting for justice, but his message is to all Southerners. He's most upset not with the Klan, not with the police. He's most upset with those that just watch from the sidelines. He called them the moderates. He specifically identified religious leaders in white congregations or synagogues. But it's a timeless message. I was recently at a conference, and it was dedicated to Fred Gray, who's still alive. He was Reverend King's lawyer, and his fingerprints are on every major civil rights legislation in the state in the last 70 years. And Reverend Gray's message is that for today, what will you do? You know, during these moments in which things are changing, what will you do as a civil rights lawyer? It was a legal conference, or as an historian or a public historian, what will you do? And I linked that notion, what Frederick Gray, what would you do, to Reverend King sitting in the jail writing about the need for folks to get off the sidelines and at least try to support and become engaged in justice struggles, whatever you think that needs to happen. So it's Reverend King's book. It's called Why We Can't Wait. And it strikes me as vital reading today, yesterday, and tomorrow.
And then for your last question, what is one of the most rewarding student moments you've ever had?
So there's many of them. I will say that I offer a class in Alabama memory, the history of lynching in the state. And almost every single semester, a student will pull me aside. They'll be very quiet, and they'll say, I just learned of a lynching in my family. And sometimes it's a white student whose family was on the wrong side, right? They were prosecutors, or they were perpetrators. Sometimes it's a black student who suddenly their grandmother learns about the class they're taking. They tell me that it's new knowledge to them, but they say they're okay. You know, they say that somehow in some way they know this history needed to be told to them. They can work with it, and they can use it to become a better person, but also to sort of join a larger struggle for justice. I'm always stunned by how often that happens, which is another way to think about how violence has permeated our society for a very long time. But it's also a blessing, because here's a student that didn't know this piece of their family history, and they were told it or they experienced it. And it's a mix of both enormous sadness, but confidence that they can go forward with that and use that to engage in some struggle for justice that's important for them.
Gosh, that is so powerful. John, thank you so much for spending time with us today. This has just been a wonderful conversation. We hope you've enjoyed it.
I have. It's been my pleasure.
Well, good.
Yay.
So we want to thank our guest, John Giggie, for being on Coffee and History, a conversation with Alabama Heritage. You can find our podcast wherever you listen, and then you can also watch us on our YouTube channel. Be sure to follow us, like us, give us a rating, or especially we'd love to hear a comment if you so dare. But don't forget, if you want to subscribe to our print magazine, just log on to alabamaheritage.com. Until next time, thanks for listening. But first, I need more coffee.
Amen.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Coffee and History, a conversation with Alabama Heritage, is brought to you by the good folks at Wind Creek Hospitality and the Porch Creek Indians. Our theme music is composed by Paul Lewis Reeves and Jay Price. Our editor, Robert Briscoe, ensures we sound fantastic. Listen each Tuesday for new episodes wherever you get your podcast, or visit our website at alabamaheritage.com.